Greetings, everybody, and welcome to a brief overview of Chapter 2, The Constitution. Just a few things to keep in mind as we continue on early here in the semester. Make sure to check out the clip for this week, American Government Crash Course, episodes 1 through 3. The link for this is in the syllabus. It is also right here. I also do post PDF versions of these weekly mini lectures, and hopefully that'll help you with taking notes or accessing links and all that kind of stuff. Each week, complete the weekly checklist that is available under Materials and Checklist to make sure that you're doing everything that you need to do to keep up with this class. You can start thinking about that first analysis paper, which is coming up in about 3 weeks or due in about 3 weeks. Take a look at the grading rubric carefully. Reach out to me with any questions, and I'm always happy to advise you. Again, for these, you can choose a news item that closely relates to concepts from recent reading, or you can select one of the assigned films for the class and use that as a topic of your analysis paper. Don't forget that every week we have a quiz that covers that week's learning outcomes. So focus on those, make sure that you understand what we're getting at there. And take that short quiz sometime between Friday and Sunday. It is timed. You have 15 minutes to take a 10-question quiz. These are not meant to be make or break. I drop the 2 lowest scores at the end of the semester, or if you miss one, obviously that would be one of the ones that I drop. This is just a way to make sure that you are following along with the reading and that you are achieving the weekly learning outcomes.
And here are those learning outcomes for the week. We'll identify the historical and political significance of the Mayflower Compact. We'll analyze the significance of the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation and the weaknesses of the Articles. We'll identify the most important compromises reached at the Constitutional Convention and the structure of the resulting government. We'll recognize the differences between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist positions, the role of the Federalist Papers, and the need for the Bill of Rights, and we'll outline the process of amending the Constitution.
All right, let's briefly go over the early colonial background in the United States. The first permanent settlement, 1607, was the Jamestown Trading Post. This was an economic enterprise. The goal here was to make money. Even so, it was important in terms of establishing some political norms in the United States because the great distance in what became the United States and England meant that settlers needed to govern themselves to some degree. They couldn't, the English king couldn't engage in direct rule. The distances were just too great. So they had the power and authority to make rules and laws and largely govern themselves. The other noteworthy early experience, obviously, is the experience of the separatists. Sometimes we refer to them as pilgrims. They sought to break from the Church of England that they thought was not conservative enough, established their own religious utopia in New England, in what became New England. What's noteworthy here is that the members, the males on the Mayflower, as they approached New England, as they approached Plymouth, they agreed to give up some of their liberties so that the remainder be protected. They signed a compact. They signed an agreement to create a degree of order and give up some liberty in terms of doing so. And so that's sort of the big significance of the Mayflower Compact. So again, there were similarities and there were differences between the Jamestown experience and the Plymouth experience. Jamestown, again, this is a money-making enterprise set up by the Virginia Company, ultimately under the authority of the King of England. But the king deferred and allowed the settlers to govern themselves out of practicality. But ultimately, the authority still remained with the English government. This is different than the Plymouth experience. These folks are off the grid. The separatists are doing their own thing. And so they agree on a compact to give up some of their individual liberties so that the remainder can be protected. This is the Mayflower Compact. This is a form of a social compact. Keep in mind, when I say they, we are talking about the white male separatists. So I don't want to make it sound like this was a democratic example as we would think of one in the contemporary environment. Okay, let's fast forward about 150 years. And you have 13 prosperous colonies in what became the United States. Of course, this prosperity is on the backs of enslaved African descendant people. It's arguable that you won't find freer people on earth than the white male citizens of these colonies. Much more prosperous, by the way, than the um, than the folks back in England. And so British Parliament is starting to say, well, wait a minute, we're spending a lot of money defending these colonies, and yet they're much more prosperous, and they're paying far fewer taxes, by the way. They're not paying a great deal of taxes back to the United Kingdom. And so the idea is to kind of change that. And this also is the first time where the monarchy starts to treat the colonies kind of like as a single unit. And this also makes the folks in the colonies see themselves more as a unit, as opposed to Georgia being Georgia and Virginia being Virginia, and so on. And again, the major reason for this increase in taxation from the perspective of the British Parliament and the King was to pay off the debt that was incurred defending the colonies in the French and Indian Wars. Do spend time understanding the significance of these milestones. 1760, George III decides to raise revenue for the reasons I just mentioned, and that American colonists had paid very little taxes up to that point, which was one of the reasons for the great prosperity in the United States, one of many, what became the United States. As the British government starts to assert itself, there's a pushback on the part of the colonists, and the United Kingdom was dependent on the colonies to buy finished British goods because of the relative wealth and prosperity. So this is kind of this back and forth that we see. There's an attempt by the king, there's an attempt by Parliament to levy taxes on colonists, and there's a pushback. There is a retreat because of the economic importance of the colonies to the British government. But as we get into the 1770s, we see greater willingness of the British to engage in direct rule, to attempt to engage in direct rule, and closing Boston Harbor. The British Parliament passes the Coercive Acts. This is an attempt to end indirect rule, allowing the colonies to largely govern themselves, and start to engage in much more direct rule. And this obviously is creating a response from colonial leaders, and the colonists are starting to see themselves in it together. Again, more milestones. The First Continental Congress, this is really about bringing grievances to the British government, trying to get things back to the good old days of largely self-rule, low taxation, and yet the British government providing defense and support of the colonies. Even during the Second Continental Congress, as fighting had broken out between colonist militia members and British troops, ultimately the goal was to maintain ties with the United Kingdom, but of course indirect as opposed to direct rule. So I'm not going to go through each of these. We'll explore some more, but make sure that you understand the importance of these milestones. Again, the goal of the First Continental Congress, where 12 of the 13 colonies met, except Georgia, was to restore the structure that colonists enjoyed before the British tried to assert direct control. And if, the Crown and Parliament had backed off, it's pretty unlikely the Declaration of Independence would ever have been issued. Second Continental Congress, as I mentioned before, fighting is breaking out between colonial militia members and British troops. But still, even as they appointed Washington the general commander-in-chief, the ultimate goal was to retain the previous relationship with the British. The American Revolution, the revolutionary movement in what became the United States, was not taking place in a vacuum. This was taking place in a time and world history and European history, where people were starting to question the relationship between rulers and the people and their subjects. What was the responsibility of kings and leaders? And so there are some important concepts that came out of the Enlightenment period. One is the concept of natural rights, that people have certain rights just because they're human. That might not seem particularly revolutionary today, but at the time, particularly from the perspective of a king, this was a revolutionary thing. I mean, if you were subject to the authority of a king, if you were a king's subject, you were their property. You were something that belonged to them. But the concept of natural rights challenged that, right? That people hold certain rights just because they're a person, they're human. And the idea that governments can't take away these rights. In fact, the idea that governments work for people as opposed to people working for the government. So Locke described these rights as life, liberty, and property. Jefferson largely plagiarized this and described them as these rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which has a nice ring to it. Now, of course, this is occurring at the very same time the Enlightenment thinkers like Jefferson had to kind of twist themselves in knots, because at the very same time they were making arguments that people had fundamental rights just because they were human beings. They were profiting off of the slave trade. They were profiting off of slave labor within the United States. And Jefferson dealt with this internally by blaming the British, by blaming King George for thrusting the institution of slavery on the colonies, and that people like Jefferson and other slave owners were also victims of this system that was perpetuated by the British. Another concept, too, that is suggested by Locke and is a product of the Enlightenment, and it relates to the Mayflower Compact, which is that in a society, there's a general agreement between the people and the government. People on the individual level, just like with the Mayflower Compact, they agree to give up some of their liberties so that the remainder of those liberties are protected. So do spend time this week rethinking or reconsidering America's founding and its independence. We're raised with patriotic stories through grade school and our education. And in many cases, we start to think about creation of the United States as being inevitable, but it was far from that. If the British had dropped their demands or fought the war more vigorously up front, it's really unlikely that there would ever have been an independence movement. It's also important to recognize that the leaders of the American Revolution didn't know how this was going to end. This was an unusually competent, thoughtful group of individuals, and they were the elites across these British colonies. And so the quality of leadership was extremely high. Their ability to stick together was amazing. And the fact that citizens across the colonies saw the most prominent leaders signing up to sever ties with the United Kingdom, signing up to sever ties with the British, that sent a very powerful message to the people who would ultimately, the men largely, who would ultimately fight the war. It's also important to recognize, too, that the so-called founding fathers, they disagreed dramatically amongst themselves about what kind of country they wanted. So we see this in things like the Hamilton play that's become so popular. They do a pretty good job illustrating this, but they had extremely divergent views. Was this going to be a slave owning society or not? Was it going to be a society that is based on commerce and big cities, or was it going to be an agrarian society where people made their livelihoods on farms, and again, largely on the backs of enslaved people? So they had great disagreements as to what kind of country they wanted and they desired. And so initially, people were banding together to fight the British, but they hadn't even really started to think about what they wanted to replace the colonial structure with. Franklin said rather famously, we must all hang together, or surely we'll all hang separately. And that's an important thing to mention, that if these leaders of independence movement, prominent people, the most prominent people within the colonies, had lost. They were the leaders. They had a lot on the line here, and their followers, the more average settlers, recognized that they had a lot on the line as well. A few more things to think about here. There had never been a successful colonial rebellion before the American Revolution. It hadn't happened. There had never been a successful Republican government in such a large country. So we think about North America being sparsely populated during this period of time, but there still were 4 million people spread across these 13 American colonies. Now, the term republic or republican, we need to drill down what this means. This is a country that's without a monarch. They don't have a monarch, where power is ultimately in the hands of the citizens. So the United Kingdom today can never be a republic, even though it's a democracy, because they continue to have a monarch. So it's important to understand what that term means. And it was going to be hard to create a functional republic in such a large and diverse country because, again, things are spread out. Each colony had very different political cultures, some slave owning, some not. Some settled for economic reasons, some settled for religious reasons and cultural reasons. So these were very diverse political cultures that were going up and down the eastern seaboard of what became the United States. It's also important to recognize that the idea that the United States would survive and become an entity among itself like we see today was probably the least likely scenario. Okay? So even if the Americans win the war against the British, which was still not likely, the most likely scenario would be that the United States would at some point dissolve into independent states, and that almost happened during the United States Civil War. And then keep in mind, too, a key reason for fighting the British is because these colonists distrust distant government. So why would you overthrow a distant British government only to create a new distant government in Washington, D.C., or New York, or Pennsylvania, or in Philadelphia? So this is something that we continue to deal with today. So what I'm suggesting in these recent slides is that the outcome of the War of Independence, the creation of the United States, was arguably one of the least likely scenarios here. Our initial government, the Articles of Confederation, I do want you to spend a good deal of time understanding this. This is very weak. It was designed to be weak purposely, for the reasons I just mentioned. Why overthrow a strong, distant government in the British if you're just going to create a new distant government in the United States? And also keep in mind, there's no rail networks, or very little, in the United States at this point. There's no transportation systems. Most people are not going to, if you're from Georgia, you're never going to go to New York. You're never going to go to Vermont. You're never going to go to New England State. And so, people are very much the product of their colony. So there was a great deal of concern about too much distant authority. So much so that the initial structure of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, was doomed to failure because there just wasn't enough authority vested in the central government to provide to protect the United States and to provide some structure and order. In your reading, spend time understanding how the Articles of Confederation were structured, the powers that it gave Congress, the powers that Congress lacked. And even though the Articles of Confederation ultimately was a failure, it laid out some principles that would go on to become adopted in the U.S. Constitution. When you think about America's founding, think about it in two phases. Okay, you have 1776, the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, the creation of this very weak confederal government under the Articles of Confederation. This is the separation with Britain. But this isn't about what we're going to become. This is the decision to depart. This is the decision to do something else. And it's not until the Constitutional Convention that we start to establish the institutions, the rights that are form the foundation of the United States Constitution and our systems of government today. So the Constitution was arguably more important in creating a nation than simply the decision to separate from the British. As you're reading about the Constitutional Convention, really think and analyze these really messy compromises that are necessary between states with large populations and those with small populations, slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states. Of course, under the Articles of Confederation, all the states were treated equally. And big states didn't like that. They wanted power based on population. Of course, small states didn't want to just be absorbed into this new United States. So this leads to the Great Compromise, two legislative houses. That's what bicameral means, two legislative houses. We have a Senate, which each state is treated equally, and we have a House of Representatives where each state is given a number of members of the House of Representatives based on their population. There's also arguably the ugliest part of the Constitution, the Three-Fifths Compromise. Slaveholding states wanted enslaved people counted as part of their population. Of course, they didn't want to give enslaved people the vote. Non-slave states did not want that. So ultimately, the compromise that comes out are that slaves are considered 3/5 of a person for determining representation in the House of Representatives. James Madison introduces the idea of separation of powers. That's why I refer to this as the Madisonian model, that there would be three branches of government: legislative branch, power to make laws; judicial branch, power to judge the legality of laws; and the executive branch, the power to administer the laws. And with each of these branches, the ability to check each other. Also, there's the issue of how you're going to select the President of the United States. Ultimately, they decided on Electoral College. Each state would have a different amount of votes in the Electoral College, and that would be equal to their total amount of congressional representation. So in Minnesota, we've got 2 members of the Senate, like every other state. We have 8 members of the House. We have 10 votes in the Electoral College. Initially, electors in the Electoral College were able to be independent. They might have an election at the state level for president, but they could, exercise their independence and vote against how the people within their state selected to go. These electors were chosen by state legislators. Today, state laws require those electors to vote along with the outcome of the election in that state. So if Minnesota goes for a certain candidate, all 10 of those Electoral College votes must vote for that candidate for president. I've already discussed the Madisonian model in my previous slide. You have a grid similar to this in your text. Spend some time looking at the different terms between the federal offices and consider the reasons for this. So in the House of Representatives, they're only elected for 2 terms. Initially, it was only the House of Representatives, 1/2 of one branch of government that was directly elected by the people. The Senate was chosen by state legislatures. The president was chosen by an electoral college. Judges are chosen by the president with confirmation in the Senate. So an important thing to think about, too, is that for all the discussion about democracy, the founding generation and the folks who drafted the Constitution were very skeptical about too much democracy, so much so that, like I said, you only have 1/2 of one branch of government that is directly selected by voters. And again, we've explored checks and balances already, but in your reading, spend some time understanding how the presidency, the judiciary, and Congress have the power to check one another. Okay, so now we have a document, we have the Constitution, but it's far from certain at this point whether or not the states will accept this Constitution. And this is the process of ratification, getting 9 out of the 13 colonies to accept the Constitution and for the Constitution to take effect. The national debate that occurred was between the Federalist people who wanted this new, stronger federal government that's outlined in this new Constitution, and those who are opposed, the anti-Federalists. And the debate that occurred, the discussion that occurred, happened in many cases authored by elites through newspapers across the country. The Federalist Papers were the argument from the Federalist side, led by Hamilton, led by James Madison and John Jay, they together composed these arguments that are in favor of ratification of the Constitution. It becomes immediately clear that there's just too much concern about so much power being placed in the hands of this new federal government. There's going to be a demand to amend the document right away. And the first 10 amendments of the Constitution were those changes, which we also refer to as the Bill of Rights, which protects individual liberties and also the liberties of the states. It's adopted in 1791, and it's a compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists in order to get the Constitution ratified. I won't spend a lot of time with this. We're going to engage in discussion of the Bill of Rights, particularly when we talk about civil liberties in a couple of weeks. But spend some time familiarizing yourself with them and consider why it was so important that these changes were made right away in order to ratify the Constitution. Okay, amending the U.S. Constitution. It's really hard. It's only happened 27 times in American history. The typical way this occurs is a 2/3 vote in both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate, and approval by 3/4 of the states through their legislatures. This has been the process for amending the Constitution in every situation except the repeal of prohibition. Please do spend some time familiarizing yourself with the amendments to the Constitution. Again, it's only happened 27 times in American history. And maybe a broader question you should consider is, do we make it too hard to amend the Constitution? Should we make it easier? And what are the implications of that? All right, to briefly sum up, the first British settlements in what became the United States were Jamestown, which was a trading post, and the settlement in Plymouth. The significance of that was the Mayflower Compact that they created, and this is the first formal government with the consent of the governed. So those who were among the separatist settlers agree to give up some of their liberties so that the remainder can be protected. The most revolutionary aspects of the Declaration of Independence were moored in the ideas of the Enlightenment, that people have natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which really was a revolutionary idea, especially from the perspective of monarchs. And that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. So people don't work for governments, governments work for people, or at least that's the idea. It's also important to note, and I really tried to drill this down, that the outcome of the Revolutionary War was far from certain. In fact, the way it turned out, if you were a betting person, would have been likely the least likely scenario in terms of an enduring United States. The final version of the Constitution provided for the separation of powers, the Madisonian model, and with each of the branches of government having the ability to check and balance one another. It's also a federal form of government, so the powers of the states, the regional governments, are in balance with this new federal government, and that power is mapped out in a constitution. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It includes those fundamental liberties and freedoms of religion, speech, assembly. Now, originally, the Bill of Rights was meant only to check the power of this new federal government, but over the course of American history, it has been incorporated to all levels of government, the state and local level too. And again, I want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about the amendment process to the Constitution. Is it too difficult? Is it too rigid? We've only had 27 amendments in American history. You make it too easy to amend the Constitution, ends up kind of being a mushy document. You make it too hard, it can't change with the times. So I do want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about that. And here are the guiding questions for the week, and I'm not going to go over them individually, but make sure that you read the grading rubric carefully and fully participate in discussion and participation, because it is worth 20% of your overall grade. Have a rockin' week. Please stop by during office hours on Zoom if you have any questions or concerns, or shoot me an email. Most of the class seems to be off to a great start, so let's just keep it going.